to turn to New York, where Governor Cuomo has declared what some are calling a war on education. His State of the State address, in it the governor calling for education reforms that include threats to teacher tenure and the evaluation system, as well as an increased cap on charter schools. Tonight, we're speaking with two education officials who are going after teacher tenure in New York, and they're taking their battle to the courts. And President Obama still being attacked from the right after referencing the Crusades at a national prayer breakfast. Was the president out of line, or was he just making a point? Plus, this guy's had a tough week here. I'm talking about Brian Williams, the NBC Nightly News anchor, and he's put himself on timeout. He's stepping away from the news desk for a while as he waits for the scandal around his war story to simmer. The question is, can he recover from his mistake? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thanks so much for joining us. And tonight, we're going to begin in New York, where Governor Cuomo has vowed to reform the education system from the bottom up. Now, last month, in his State of the State address, Governor Cuomo said, among other things, that our education system needs dramatic reform, and it has for years. And I believe this is the year to do it, end quote. Governor's made it clear that teacher tenure may be one of the first items on the list that will be overhauled.
We propose tenure to only be granted when a teacher achieves 5 consecutive years of effective ratings. And once we have a fair evaluation system, we can incentivize performance. And we will.
Now, the governor would also like the state to be granted more power to fix failing schools. He would also like to develop new standards for teachers who are just entering the profession. Governor stated that only a third of incoming teachers were not reading at a level of high school senior. Cuomo would also like high-performing teachers to receive a bonus. All right, let's bring in our panel right now. Mona Davids, president of the New York City Parents Union. Sam Perozzola rejoins us. He's the vice president of the New York City Parents Union. Jeannie Zaino, professor of political science at Iona College and a professor of campaign management as well at NYU. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, so much more. And Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. All right, guys, we'll all jump in here, but I want to get your point. And guys, I think philosophically, I probably agree more than not. But for the purpose of this, I'll play devil's advocate and I'll read some of the competing arguments why teacher tenure, from some educators' perspective, if changed the way the governor's talking about and that you guys propose, would do more harm than good. And this first one comes from Michael Mulgrew, who's the president of the New York City Teachers Union, and this is what he had to say. Without tenure, teachers can be disciplined or even fired for speaking out on behalf of the needs of their students. Speak to that issue, that if there isn't safety, especially at low-performing schools, that a comment from a student, a concern by a parent, whether unfounded or not, could derail an educator's career here as a standpoint, and the tenure from his perspective and others is a necessary tool to give teachers stability.
Well, first of all, we're not going after teacher tenure. Okay, we think the teacher should have tenure. We just think that 3020A, which are the laws that govern tenure, should be made easier, that when a teacher is found to be unsatisfactory, like we had this recent case of a teacher for 6 years in New York City being found unsatisfactory, just at the precipice of being fired, like we said last time, you know, the arbitrator goes, well, how about some more professional development? Other than that, the comment is bogus.
How long do you think a teacher will need to be either on the job or a high performer, as the governor said, before he or she should be eligible for tenure?
Well, our recommendation that is outlined in our complaint is that we want the probationary period increased from 3 to 5 years. And we believe that 5 years is sufficient time to determine if a teacher has earned tenure. It also gives us enough time to see the data and see the progress of that teacher's students. We want effective teachers in the classrooms who are going to improve the educational outcomes of our children, and 3 years is simply not enough to determine that.
All right, let me read a quote from the mayor, who is at odds with Governor Cuomo, at least on his proposal to this end. Mayor de Blasio is saying the tenure system, quote, if done right, is a valuable piece of the way that we educate, because what's going to allow us to get quality teachers, get them to stay in our school system. What about the concern that if, let's use the 5-year model you lay out, if one year they get a low-performing classroom through no fault of their own, and the kids don't do well on the tests. Now all of a sudden they don't have 5 continuous years of performance, maybe through no, indication on their teaching abilities. They just had a class that either didn't do well in the tests, or they had a class that were a bunch of low performers or whatever else, but that their performance is downgraded, maybe not because of what they did, but because of what the kids did. Is that a fair concern?
No, it's not a fear or concern. The fact of the matter is, in New York City's public school system, we have, on average, about 70% of our children who are not reading, writing, and doing math at grade level. Even before Common Core, prior to Common Core, we have had a supermajority of the students not at grade level. I will give you an example of my child's school. I'm from the Bronx. My son's school, PS 106, where my son is in first grade, that school has, on average, a 77% failure rate on the test scores. They've had this failure rate now for many years, even before Common Core. And the same teachers who are teaching 3rd to 5th grade continue to teach year after year the same grades, and the children are not learning. So how do we improve the educational outcomes of our children? How can we ensure that children such as my son have a chance to receive a high quality education where for years, many, many years, we have teachers who are simply not performing, but they're being rated now effective and highly effective, and prior to that, satisfactory. The numbers do not add up. We need a better teacher evaluation system.
You've been on both sides of this as a parent and as an educator, right? When you hear it, and you hear the 2 different schools of thought from the mayor and the governor on this, do you understand teachers who say, using the same exact system, a lot of these kids are coming to school without knowing basic, maybe alphabets, I'm making this up or whatever else here, but yet you expect the teacher to be a miracle worker? Or what about the first grade teacher might be doing a good job, but the kindergarten teacher dropped the ball and we're inheriting it? Where should accountability start and stop when it comes to who's in the front of the classroom?
I do. You can understand it from both sides. Being both a parent and an educator, you really can see it from both sides. My fear is always that teachers are under attack and blamed for things that they cannot control in a system that far exceeds anything that they have the ability to change. And so that's always my fear. And I do actually think that a 5-year tenure, a 7-year tenure system even makes sense. I am not opposed to that. But I also think that our public officials, Governor Cuomo and others, have to do a better job of looking beyond just the teachers as a culprit in this. I mean, you mentioned the Common Core, and as much as, I support parts of the Common Core, there are other aspects of the Common Core that really have to do with the economics of big publishing companies and others who are invested in education in a way that the states have applauded and funded. And yet that isn't helping the students as much. So I think there are other issues here that aren't addressed when you just specifically focus on teachers. So, do I have a problem with extending tenure? No, I actually don't. Yet I would like the focus to be on more than just the teachers and their ability to make change, because I think just like in, I'm sorry for the bad analogy, when you're looking at football and you're blaming one football player for bad behavior, there is a system there supporting this. And I think the system is what needs to be changed, not just the teachers working within it.
Well, so to add to it, that's exactly what we're advocating for, is to change the system. We're not blaming teachers. We even support teachers. But everything does not come down to a test. So you're talking about the teacher evaluations. We don't believe that a test should be the sole determining factor. Your good principals still have portfolios for their teachers that even if a child doesn't do well on the test, there are other guidelines. But let me keep in mind and remind you that throughout history, we have students who can't control their own circumstances either.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
And we grade our students, we judge our students, we accept them to high school, we accept them to college on how they perform on a test. Now, never before has Michael Mulgrew threatened to punch anyone in the face in protection of a student on how well he's done on a test. Never before has McGee from NYSET gone to war to protect students on how they do on a test. But all of a sudden, when we want to use the test metric on including it into teachers, then all of a sudden it's the worst thing in the world and it's totally wrong. We shouldn't do that.
But if you're not holding teachers solely responsible for students not performing at grade level, what are the bases for which you're going to evaluate teachers? How do you determine who's a successful teacher and deserves tenure track versus who doesn't?
Well, we have to have a judge give us permission to do that first. I'm not an
But
educational expert. We
but
have
if
to get there.
if the system gets torn down or modified through the lawsuit, what would be the structure? What's the replacement?
We'll have to work on when we get there. We'll have to speak to people who are educational experts, and we'll have to speak to different people from all different sources, and we'll have to rebuild the system from the ground up, because that's what it needs.
There's also, many argue, a dirty little secret about where teachers teach. Randy Weingarten, who's president of the American Federation of Teachers, said that, quote, "There's a real problem facing America's teaching profession, but it has nothing to do with tenure. The problem's recruiting, retaining, and supporting the teachers, especially at the hardest to staff schools." And Dominic, the teacher's going to make 55 grand here at a poor district, and they're fresh out of college and they don't even have a master's on this, versus somebody who gets a better opportunity to go teach at a nicer public school in a leafy suburb and they're making 90 grand a year. Where do you think they're going to go? That's part of it too, right? You got people who are ill-equipped to be at the front of the classroom because people that have options don't want to be there for the same number. In fact, they'd have to take a pay cut to go there.
Very valid point. I understand and I sympathize with having grown up in the Bronx and attended Bronx schools from PS 70, and I can go on through a litany of the Bronx schools that I attended. I sympathize with you. But I do agree with the professor. I feel that we're scapegoating the teachers, because we all know, and I'm curious in your response on this, we all know that these kids are coming to school, I was one of them, with enormous obstacles. And some, the dirty little secret will say, some of these kids, can't be taught. Now, I disagree with that. But is it really fair to throw the onus, if you will, on teachers and for their evaluations to be at 50% based on how kids do on testing? Is that really fair?
Well, I think that up to 50% is fair, because the fact of the matter is our children are not reading, writing, and doing math at grade level.
But is that the teacher's fault? Is that solely the teacher's fault?
It is not solely the teacher's fault, but that's why there would be, the teachers would be evaluated separately. They will receive the professional development. They will receive the additional counseling and support that they need, but at the same time, they must be held accountable for the educational outcomes of our children. And grading the teachers and using up to 50%, not necessarily 50%, but up to 50%, yes, is fair, because the fact of the matter is our children are educable. And the fact of the matter is that right now in New York City, we have a supermajority of children for generations. At PS 106, we now have parents there who came to that school. We even have grandparents now that came to that school, and they say the same thing. The school was always a low-performing school.
But you know that there are extenuating circumstances in our community.
Absolutely.
The family structure. Daddy's not home. Mommy's not paying attention to school.
But that sounds more of an excuse.
Right. You're also assuming that a successful teacher is a teacher who has a student who is at grade level. Successful teachers can be a student who brings a child from a 1 to a 2, who maintains a 1. There are different levels of success. So it's all UFT hype and fear-mongering when they say that we want to get rid of bad teachers. And, we're talking about children, 70% who are not at grade level. We want to improve the education of
but if 70% are not at grade level, how are you going to blame the teacher?
Because they are in the classroom. They are the #1. Studies show that a teacher...
But it sounds like you're expecting them to wave a magic wand, and presto, these kids at 70% behind level, they'll get them at grade level.
What I'm expecting is to win this lawsuit and that the entire system is redeveloped and redesigned, because that's what it needs. And as parents, this lawsuit is the only means that we have of accomplishing this.
But I'm sorry, Sam, you just mentioned that, and you've used the stat that 70% of students aren't at grade level, but then you just mentioned, well, a teacher can raise a performance of a student from a 1 to a 2. That doesn't bring that student up to grade level. So that's still a failing teacher, even if that teacher has helped
no,
with an
no,
improvement.
that's not a failing
with the
teacher.
evaluation
That's not what we're
system,
looking
with the
for.
proposed evaluation system, because if the children are improving, the teacher's evaluation will be based on that improvement. The other thing that we also really and truly need to look at is that these are children's lives. These are children's futures here that are on the line. And whenever decisions are made regarding the education of our children, parents, the real stakeholders in this system, we have no voice. And yes, we would have, for example, loved for the legislature to come up with a better teacher evaluation system. We would have
Well,
loved
if I could, only
for...
because the time is short, I want to ask one last question to you guys. Let's say, as part of the suit, more than just in terms of reassessing the school, they said to you, okay, we'll increase the budget, I'll make this up by 20% for the schools, right? Would you rather put that money into better teachers, better preschool programs, better after-school programs, more activities on the side? If being somebody on the ground level on this, and you're saying sometimes you have generations, if not multi-generations, that go through the same school system, it's the same question for both of you. Where do you think would have the most material impact? So when the kid comes to the second grade teacher, it's not 70% that aren't reading a grade level, that aren't. It's only 30% that aren't. And then they have, you would argue, a better fighting chance. What's the best way to prepare the kids better if there were more funding attached?
Two things. First, of course, would be early childhood programs, pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, and then, of course, class size. Class size matters.
Yep.
We agree that, we need more funding going towards our schools, but the money must be used wisely. And right now, New York State, the per pupil funding in New York State is one of the highest funding in the country, and we're not seeing the outcomes.
Sam, last question.
So the number one thing is going to have to be class size, and I'm not talking about push-in teachers. I'm talking about a classroom that has 18 students in it, not a classroom with 36 and 2 teachers. Class size is extremely important. And let's just point out that teachers have pointed out that they can't fix the social ills of their students. Okay, so they're admitting that more money is not going to solve the problem. So I don't want to just throw money into the school system. It cannot be a cookie cutter approach. Mona's school may need something different than my school, which may be something different than your school. So a system has to be developed where everything is tackled and handled on an individual basis. The cookie cutter approach we have seen for the last 50 years does not work, needs to be changed, and that's what we're saying.
I got to hear a break, but when do you think you're going to hear from the judge?
Within 90 days.
Okay. Very interesting, and we will follow as always. Sam, Mona, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having
All right,
us.
and head over to Facebook and Twitter and answer our question as well here that we just touched. How do you believe teachers ought to be evaluated? What would be the best yardsticks for that? All right, when we come back here, we'll turn to something closer home for a lot of us here, and that's news business, and specifically Brian Williams. What ought to happen to Mr. Williams in your vantage point? He's taking a break from the anchor desk after allegedly lying or exaggerating about his experience on a helicopter in Iraq. Can his career recover from the scandal? And just how forgiving do you think the American public will be? We'll be right back after this.